So let's get down to the business. We're going to meet the first of our keynote speakers for this particular session. And the gentleman in question is Gunter Kreisen. Now, he's the Executive Underwriting Officer of Global Property at Markel. And what he's going to be talking about is the impact of climate change on risk and the action that insurers need to take if they're going to be better equipped to face the challenges ahead. So you guys have heard enough of me, okay? So I'm going to hand you over to Gunter. He's a lot more interesting. He's got something very important to say. So Gunter, please, the floor is yours. Show your appreciation. Come on.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for the opportunity to present today. This is actually very surreal, thinking that we're here live and not sitting behind a screen somewhere in a far off place. But thank you again for the opportunity. Thank you again, Insurance Innovators. We've got a couple topics that we're going to talk through today in relation to climate change. And I thought I'd really start out by level setting what we mean by some of the risks that we're challenged with as an insurance industry as it relates to climate change. And I'll try and unpack what is a very busy slide here. But on the y-axis, so looking on the far left, that's looking at the overall net carbon emissions historically that we've seen around the globe, and then kind of some of the future trends that we see from a climate change or a carbon emissions perspective over the next several years. So if you look at the x-axis, that really gives you an overview of the time continuum that we're trying to understand, and all those individual lines represent what we call RCPs, or representative concentration pathways. So these are just different types of scenarios based upon either climate action, so action where we're implementing some of the changes in alignment with the Paris Agreement, so really reducing the amount of carbon emissions that we're emitting from all the varying industries out there in the world, or we have some climate inaction, which really represents the top end curves. And you can see the temperature on the far right-hand side of that y-axis starts to increase. So as insurers, we really look at two different buckets. The one is the physical risk. So that's the physical risk created, and we'll unpack a little bit more about the physical risk around more increased hurricanes, sea level rise, et cetera, as we get hotter from an Earth's temperature standpoint. So as we see just that overall change in carbon emissions and change in the Earth's temperature, we're going to have a lot more physical risk that we need to understand. We're also going to see on the blue chart, which I realize is a little bit hard to see here, is the transition risks that are going to occur. So as we enact climate policy, as we look at reducing our overall carbon, our net carbon emissions, we're going to see some transition risks that occur as a result of that. So we'll unpack that a little bit more in terms of the physical risk and the transition risk, along with the risk exposures that are being created. So if we think about the physical risk, what comes to mind immediately is hurricane intensity. So it's looking at more severe hurricanes occurring. And that's typically categorized as anything from category 3 through category 5 hurricanes, which if you actually look at a lot of the insured damage, that represents roughly about 85% of what we pay out as an industry. That's where the majority of the damage occurs, category 3 through category 5 hurricanes. So if we're going to have more severe hurricanes, we're going to see more damage that occurs as a result of the impacts that we're seeing with the Earth's temperature increasing. Wildfires, they probably have the largest and the biggest signal strength as it relates to climate change. And we're certainly seeing that play out on the West Coast. We've seen just the devastation that's occurred as a result of wildfires, and just the ability for people to even live in certain areas and procure insurance in certain areas is being impacted based upon what we're seeing real time in relation to the impacts from climate change through the wildfire peril. And then sea level rise. While it's a very small amount of sea level rise that we're seeing every year, roughly about 3.5 millimeters per year, that continues to impact what we see on sunny day tidal flooding. I don't know who had the opportunity to see some of the videos and some of the pictures of the devastation that occurred on the Outer Banks, North Carolina, where we see homes just being swept into the sea. That's all a result of what we're seeing with just that sunny day tidal flooding. And if you think about some of the additional impacts that are going to occur with more severe hurricanes, increase in storm surge as a result of the sea level rise, those are all risks that we're trying to get our hands around and make sure that we understand. If we flip to the other side of it and think about transition risks, there's going to be some technology transition that occurs. So everything that you might be familiar with, from solar panels to fuel cell technology, that is going to create risks to us as insurers, and we need to be able to, one, support our clients in making that transition, but also make sure that we understand what those risks bring to us as an industry because it is going to impact profitability long term. Attribution risk, the SEC just recently released some requirements around disclosure, scope 1, scope 2 emissions disclosures that are going to be required by all companies. That's going to result in more correlation with some of the attribution risk, which potentially sets us up for some increased lawsuits down the road as we're able to tie more closely individual companies contributing to climate change. That potentially opens us up for more lawsuits or more companies being impacted through lawsuits down the road. And then ultimately change in climate policy. So as we see overall changes in climate policy, that's certainly going to impact it. So it creates a fair amount of risk exposures that we need to make sure that we're managing as an organization. Okay. Any questions on that before I move to the next slide? Anyone here specifically dealing with some of the actions from changes in climate policy? Lively group. They're just warming up. So let's just kind of break this down a little bit and look at what are some of the direct and indirect impacts that we're seeing as a result of climate change. If we really bucket it in two different levels, looking at severity and then looking at frequency and seeing just some of the scenarios that we've unpacked. First is looking at rare earth metals. Rare earth metals go into roughly everything we see today, from our phones to computers. That's going to be impacted just based upon increased rainfall and just really the dispersion that we're seeing from rainfall patterns, which is going to potentially impact roughly 20% of the production of rare earth metals. So the mining impacts, the flooding that's going to occur, that's certainly going to impact the ability to mine some of these critical metals that are used in a lot of the transition technology, but also that's going to be utilized in what we see in just our everyday electronics that we use. If we think about hurricane severity, I mentioned a little bit about category 3 through 5 hurricanes. The past 5 years alone, we've paid over $160 billion as an industry, and that's only going to potentially increase over time. So being able to make sure that we understand that exposure, and then moving a little bit to the far right side where we see a fair amount of frequency, but also from a severity standpoint, just the impact in sea level rise has the potential to devalue properties in Florida by $30 billion by 2030. And in some forecasts, they're pushing close to $80 billion by 2050. And if you actually think about Florida, 2/3 of the population lives near the coastline, and 10% lives within 5 feet of sea level. So you can imagine just the impact that you're going to see as a result of the value of people's property certainly being impacted. And then right there in the middle, I think, is a pretty important one that we look at from a workers' comp standpoint, A&H perspective, so accident and health, and just our construction and liability products, is the amount of work or lost working hours as a result of the overall increase in temperature that we're going to see. So if you think about trips and falls, accidents, just overall worker productivity, they're estimating is going to decrease by about 19% in the construction industry and about 60% in the agricultural industry. So some pretty significant reductions that we're going to see over the next several years. So what do we need to be looking at, and how are insurers really managing this risk? Well, I mentioned the physical risk, the transition risk, but we're also looking at food supply, the impacts that we see today from food supply. You've seen some of it already occur as a result of the war in Ukraine, but just what does that mean for some of the products we distribute? Political risk products, political violence, strikes, riots, civil commotion. As a world becomes more unstable as a result of the impacts on our food supply, that certainly is going to contribute to some of the profitability challenges in specific products. Livability, workability, I mentioned a little bit about that in terms of just the lost working hours, but we think about the ability to construct projects during the daytime. It's going to be awfully challenging given the fact that the temperature is going to be so hot, workers aren't going to be able to work during the day. They're going to have to shift schedules to maybe the evenings or the mornings. So not only on what we're going to see from a slips, trips, and falls standpoint, but also there's the elongation of business interruption claims that we're going to see on the first party side. So being able to manage that. And then looking at natural capital. As we see the impacts of climate change occur, we're going to see a reduction in natural capital available. Water supply, we think about barrier reefs or coral reefs, just the acidification of the ocean that's going to occur because the ocean is just a big heat sink. And when we think about the increase in temperature, the ocean's going to bear a lot of that. So all that's going to significantly impact not only what we distribute from a product standpoint, but just also some of the barriers that protect a lot of our communities today. So how must insurers really adapt to this, and what are some things that we've done at Markel? Well, one is really looking at scenario development. So we've looked at near-term, medium-term, and long-term in terms of the impact from physical risk as well as transition risk. In certain cases, we've implemented changes to pricing and terms and conditions. Climate change exclusion is one particular area in some of our liability policies. Looking at changes in pricing, so being able to capture that increased pricing that we need to charge for the increased risk exposure as a result of these enhanced exposures that we're seeing from climate change. The third piece is really looking at our risk tolerances. So we know our exposures are going up, and we need to make sure that as it's getting closer to our risk tolerances, that are we effectively managing the amount of capital that we're committing, and is it getting above our overall risk tolerances, or do we need to adjust our risk tolerance as an organization? And then the fourth piece is just making sure that we have a very robust ERM framework to make sure we continually capture this and make sure that we're cross-checking it, make sure that we're iterating on the concepts, because these scenarios are going to continue to evolve and change, and we need to make sure that we're on top of them. So I mentioned capital, and I'll just spend the next couple minutes just talking a little bit about the impact on capital, because I think it's extremely important. So if I were to assume a capital consumption on a current exposure base today, which is the first gray bar that you see there, and then we were to look at the same set of exposures over a period of time, going short term, medium term, and long term, and assume no change in the exposure except for the impacts that we're going to see as a result of climate change, and assume a static rate, you would see your capital consumption go up. And if we didn't change any of our pricing, you would see that red line come down, which is your return on capital metric. So starting at a 10% steady state return on capital, you would see a dilution in your overall return metrics as an organization. So it really speaks to the need to make sure that we're staying on top of terms and condition, pricing, making sure that we really understand exposures, in some cases moving back our portfolio writings in particular areas because of the impacts of climate change. And that's a key attribute that we need to make sure that we're incorporating, not only as an industry, but also making sure our clients are aware of some of these future impacts that are coming. And if I were to take that same concept and look at it from a portfolio perspective, so looking at 4 different products, product A, B, C, and D, and the dark circles represent the current state. The lighter circles represent the future state, or some of the impacts that we've analyzed as a result of climate change. And if we look at our portfolio today, it's all sitting above a 10% return on capital metric. And we can see it over time, if we're not careful and not addressing that through terms and conditions like I mentioned, we'll see a gradual shift of the portfolio, both in the size of the circle, which is the capital consumption, as well as dropping well below the overall 10% return on capital metric that we set. So you can quickly see you have a portfolio that was well above a 10% return on capital, and now it's shifted quickly to less than a 10% return on capital. Once again, speaking to the need for portfolio management, rate, terms and conditions, et cetera. So as we kind of think about the last slide I have here in terms of takeaways, at Markel we spent a lot of time looking at the individual scenario developments, and I think the key that we found is really making sure you have an enterprise framework to assess the impacts of climate change. That encompasses, for us, we're fully integrated in that we have insurance operations, reinsurance operations, and insurance-linked securities, and understanding how climate change is ultimately being impacted and overlaying those individual scenarios on all those individual products and divisions so that you understand what that magnitude is to the organization. So it's really etching out that overall enterprise framework and making sure you understand what those impacts are. The second piece, and I know a lot of the conversations over the past 2 days have been around technology and tools. There's a ton of data, ton of tools out there to help clients better assess not only the insurer's exposures, but also clients' individual exposures, around climate change. And the key, though, I would say, is to make sure that you have, and the tools you select, because we've run into this in some of the early stages, is you need to have a tool that's repeatable. So you want to be able to repeat the same exposures year over year. There's some vendor model tools that are out there today that provide a little bit of that consistency, because especially when we're presenting and disclosing these exposures to our board, we want to make sure that we've got the same repeatable process year over year and quarter over quarter. And then the third item is really just to make sure to infuse those insights to really support how you optimize and also how you manage capital. And I think that this is a critical one because we're all looking to make sure that we're generating the highest yield on the amount of capital that's being consumed in the business. Leveraging the right tools, having the right framework, and understanding those exposures really supports that overall level of optimization so that you can make sure that the capital is being efficient, you're identifying the exposures for your clients too and being able to work with them in mitigating these exposures, but then you're also being able to yield the largest return on your capital as possible as an organization. I thank you for your time. I know I only have 15 minutes and really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Big thanks there to Gunther Kreisen. Okay, we've got the foundation. Let's now build up on that because we're going to be discussing optimizing advanced analytics in underwriting. So AI, big data, and of course advanced analytics. It's fair to say that they're transforming underwriting at a rate that we haven't really seen before. And of course, what goes with that is the possibility of new opportunities, knowing how to make the best of them. So there is plenty to discuss, a big subject, and it is meat to our special guest. Can you please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Lewis Liu. Please come and join me on the stage. And let's extend the welcome to Dennis Sparks. Please come and join us. Thank you so much. It's good to see you. Please take a seat. Okay then. It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
What we tend to do before we actually go into the heart of the discussion is really to give you guys the opportunity to introduce yourself to the audience by telling them what it is that you do and for whom. So Lewis, can I start first with you and then Dennis?
Okay. Hi everyone, thanks for being here. I'm Lewis Liu, founder and CEO of Eigen Technologies. We are an intelligent document processing company or an AI company that transforms your documents. They could be anything from claims, emails, through underwriting documents, which we'll be talking about today, through to insurance policies and transforming that into structured, usable data that can use for your underwriting processes, your claims processes, or risk management processes.
Fantastic. Dennis?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dennis Sparks. I'm the Chief Underwriting Officer for Transverse Insurance Group. Transverse is one of the new hybrid fronting carriers, and we exclusively work on P&C programs.
Okay, excellent. And again, I'm sure you're familiar with this, but let me remind you already, we do take questions at the end of our panel, so please don't forget to use that app, which I'm sure you've all downloaded by now. And what we'll try to do is to get through as many of the questions as we can in the time available towards the discussion. So gentlemen, are you ready?
Yeah.
Fantastic. This is a question to both of you, but Lewis, if I could bat it in your direction first, and then Dennis, if you can take it on. Because look, I guess the question has to be, where do you think advanced analytics have had the most transformational impact when it comes to underwriting? Where are we seeing the difference?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the areas that, so when we think about the underwriting process on a sort of very conceptual level, it is very much about collecting as much information and data as possible, conveying that data in some way to some kind of model, and then making a policy decision, whether you do the deal or you don't do the deal, and conveying that back to the broker, right? And if you look at that process, each of these sort of components have both like what I would call sort of like that requires human intelligence and human experience to be able to make certain calls, but also a lot of it that requires just very mundane tasks, right? And when we think about the first part, which is around data collection, I think that what we're seeing is the ability to really capture data from all of the different sources. They could be from structured data pipelines, or in our case, they could come from your property engineering reports. They could come from your various email submissions. They can come from different audit reports. All of that needs to be inserted into a proper data format to go into your model. And I think by being able to automate that process, it's something we're certainly seeing is adding a tremendous amount of value. And I would say that if you can do that process faster, you get three big benefits. Number one, you are much faster, and oftentimes we see that the carrier that gets back to the broker the fastest generally wins that deal. Number two, you could do it cheaper, right? You could do more for the same amount of people. It's a simple cost takeout through automation. And number three is you're collecting far more information that you used to. I mean, you can make much better decisions and have much better models.
Okay, Dennis.
Yeah, I'll be a little more specific with my answer. I think in my career, I'm old enough to remember when, Gunter, that CAT modeling didn't exist. And that has had a transformational way on the way we look at property risks. Not perfect, seems to always get it wrong when an actual storm happens, but it's still far better than the method that we used to employ. The second one I would say is in the personal auto space. And I won't repeat because I know there's been more than one session during the conference where the telematics and personal auto have been touched upon, but certainly have hugely impacted that industry.
So Lewis, given that, where do you see the opportunities with unlocking actionable insights from harvesting this new data?
So I think one of the let me give a really sort of explicit example. We are working with a carrier right now. They're a relatively new carrier based in Europe, where one of the first use cases we're looking at is around property reports and property valuation reports. And they're doing a lot of the underwriting for the various components of sort of the property value chain. And just to sort of reiterate what I was saying is, in the past it would take each underwriter about, I don't know, a couple of hours to get all the correct pieces of information into their models. And now, we're seeing that if you can condense a couple of hours down to maybe about 2 minutes, suddenly, you can get back to your brokers, in about half the time. And I think that's sort of the first lever we're seeing. The second lever is obviously around costs, and third lever around better data. But I think the first two levers, you're seeing a much sort of, you can be hungrier in the way that you generate new deals, and you can basically, I think the name of the game for a lot of these younger insurance carriers is, how do I grow my business by keeping my headcount flat, right? And I think those are two really big pieces of value today, and over time, as you generate more data, you can probably go back to your historical data and make better decisions as well.
I'm glad you mentioned that expression, historical data. A question I want to put to both of you, because look, you can't have a conversation about this sector without referencing AI, but how can it help underwrite new risks when or if there isn't a wealth of historical data available? If you can tackle that first, Dennis, and then I'd love to get your take, Lewis.
Yeah, it's the same thing, except we're using the power of computing and additional data sources that the industry's always done. That you look at an exposure base, you look for a proxy to inform what you think that may be like. And you may be right, you may be wrong. I think a classic example would be comparing how this country in lawsuits around alcohol versus tobacco. No one doubts that alcohol causes fatty liver disease and is a huge detriment on people's health. But I don't see any lawsuits against big alcohol in this country, where there were loads against, but there were loads against big tobacco, right? So that is what you do, and you could be wrong, but I still think it's just using those new data sources to do the same thing the industry has always tried to do to approximate these new exposures.
And Lewis, do you agree with that?
I do, and I think it's ultimately, I think one of the, let me take a step back. So I come from the financial services space. So I know most of the insurance people are like, oh no, people in banking. Our first clients were actually banks. And one thing I've always thought that's peculiar about insurance is, from a banking, to me, I look at the cash flows as basically inverse of each other, right? If you look at the cash flow profile of a loan in a bank, you basically get a big cash payment out, which is the loan you give, and you have annuity payments over the year of X term of the loan, in which you may or may not get the payments back dependent on whether you default or not, right? That's sort of cash flow payments of a bank. The cash flow sort of payments of an insurance company is the other way around, right? Which is the fact that you have these annuity payments. At some point, you may have to have a big cash out. And I think that the nature of these two basically means that the data, that they're sort of like almost sort of mirror images of each other. And I think what's interesting is when you think about what kind of data that you collect, In banking, it's a little bit easier because you're tracking all these annuities and when they sort of cut off. But insurance, you really have to wait for a while until you get your first couple of sort of cash outs. And so I think for me, I agree. Like if you can collect as much information about these cash out points as possible, and as analogous situations as possible, I think you can. I think you can maybe get to the same level of sort of accuracy as you would in a bank.
Okay, I mean, Dennis, come back in because look, in recent years we know there has been this big proliferation of new data sources. So how can underwriters themselves actually maximize the potential of big data, because this stuff is coming at them from every direction?
I think that's a phenomenal question because it acts like a set of nesting dolls. It opens up to many other questions and avenues. And I think before that question is addressed directly, I think we have to understand what data is not. Data is not magic. I started my career as an actuary, and I am a credentialed actuary. But by the way, one of my colleagues, when I made the switch to underwriting, told me, he said, Dennis, it's awesome that you're going to underwriting because every time someone leaves the actuarial department and goes to the underwriting department, he increases the IQ of both departments. So I have no idea if it's true or not, but that's what I was told when I made the switch. But we have to disabuse ourselves of magical thinking. So I started, there were no personal computers. You had mainframe computers. If you couldn't program an APL, you could not do your job. And the biggest workspace was 25 megabytes. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, you heard me right, 25 megabytes. Try to do anything that Gunter or Lewis or dozens of other speakers have spoken about in this conference with 25 megabytes and programming an APL, you'll have a much greater appreciation for how far we've come as an industry. But even then, I'd hear actuaries say, if only we had the data, if only we had the computing power. And I'm here to tell you that we have to disabuse ourselves of that magical thinking. We always have to be mindful of privacy and ESG concerns as well. And at the end of this, I'll give two examples, one that I don't have ESG concerns about and the other one where I do. But when we think of data, data is simply just raw material, right? That's all it is. You start to build a house, you gotta have concrete, you gotta have some wood, some nails, some hammers, or whatever tools you're using. It's just raw materials. It's what you do with that. You have to scrub it. You have to organize it. You have to somehow, hopefully then, be able to see some information that may be usable. And if you find information after you do all of that and it's usable, then perhaps you can transfer that into actual actionable business decisions, right? And I think that is the key. You can start at any point in that process, but I think you can never skip. You're always either going to start at the front and go to the back or start in the middle and go up and back, but you're going to have to hit all three of those. Otherwise, you're going to come to very wrong conclusions. Two quick examples. One is one that I don't like. I won't say the name of the program administrator because I'm not trying to throw stones at anybody. But there's a program out there, and it's very successful, makes a lot of money for their carrier partner. But they have a scraping app, and if you were an employee at that company, they literally use that scraping app and they pull every single piece of information they can scrape off the internet about every single employee. Put that through a risk algorithm to determine whether or not they would even entertain underwriting the account. If they say it's okay, then they'll go do their traditional underwriting afterwards. Not sure about you guys. I am personally not comfortable with that approach. And I think there's other things, right? So what if we determine, like, for example, in this country, we've said women, yeah, we know statistically as an actuary, they have better driving results than men. But a bunch of states said, hey, you can't rate on that issue because it's not socially acceptable, right? And I would argue that with the advent of big data, it offers a lot of dangers, and somebody using all that info to underwrite a risk when you're just somebody trying to get a paycheck and showing up, and maybe you posted some silly video on one of your Twitter accounts or whatever one. I find that very disturbing, personally. Maybe I'm the only one, but I feel that way. One example that I do think is very, very good, though, is the one we already talked about a little bit in the personal auto world. You know, first they started with the little dongles and they put them in for 3 months and then they pulled them out and people reverted back to their behaviors. Now they're going to more advanced technologies which monitor it continuously. And it does, we know that it changes people's behaviors. So in that one, you're consenting, right? In the first one, you as an employee, in my opinion, haven't consented to anything. But those are two examples, I would say, that one's acceptable and the other is not. Sorry for...
No, not at all. Sorry, Lewis.
And we really want to piggyback off of two of the things we're saying. The first is around data being raw materials, right? And I think there is a lot of new alternative data sources here, right? Putting Eigen aside, and our ability to generate alternative data through the document feeds. You know, you see, satellite feeds coming in. Actually, we're recently talking about, climate risk, and I'm actually advising a company that's trying to take satellite imagery data, specifically around forests and trees, and really trying to understand what the carbon output is to better price carbon, and also, for better price carbon offsets of forests. For example, like these are all sort of new alternative data that's coming in. But what's also sort of interesting about a lot of these alternative data feeds is they also still need to be molded, right? Just a satellite picture of a forest is sort of not going to get you anywhere. Maybe you can get a human to transcribe something, but at the end of the day, to get that to automated scale, you need some kind of machine learning tool or rules-based tool to do it, which is very, very similar to, again, the documents that we process. Bunch of PDFs and emails laying on your feet is raw materials, but they need to be honed into a brick, into a steel bar, into a window to actually make that house. So I think that's one of the things to think about is, yes, there's perhaps way more raw materials, but we also need the people to make these raw materials into the building blocks.
Yeah.
And the second point is just around AI ethics, right? I think I want to go a little bit technical here, just apologies. Actually, earlier we were talking about how Schrödinger's equation which is continuous, moves in discrete, Lie algebra sets.
You just lost everybody.
I think I just lost everyone. I'm kidding. That's not what we're talking about. What I'm specifically talking about is neural networks, and it's great to have another mathematician on the panel. But anyway, specifically, I think one needs to be really careful the way we deploy quote-unquote a neural network or quote-unquote large data machine learning models. Because at the end of the day, there's not, despite what everything in Google says, there is no intelligence in these large big data AI models. They're just large statistical frameworks, right? And I think if you don't actually control for specific variables in a large statistical framework, you will end up always discriminating against gender or race in your models. That will just, the biases of society will just be naturally ingrained into these statistical inferences. So I think that when we think about AI and we think about machine learning, it's really important we have the right controls and audit trails, and just something to really be careful of as you deploy these models.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's one which always comes up in conversations around this issue. But Lewis, you touched on something in a previous response. In fact, you both did. Because look, you talked about how easy it is to gather the data, but also accessing the methodology that's also rapidly developing. You've got predictive analytics, NLP, data mining, that sort of stuff. But these tools in themselves, how are they helping to augment the underwriting process? So, Lewis, if you can give me your take, and then Dennis, I'd love to get your response too.
Yeah, I think I've already talked about it, so I won't belabor the point, right? But I think, for us, natural language processing, computer vision, these are all elements that takes your raw materials and makes it into building blocks that you could use, right? I guess you just use the analogy further. And I think one thing is that NLP by itself, or machine vision or AI by itself, doesn't do anything. It could be a shiny project that you tell your innovation committee, your CEO, yep, used AI, check the box, right? And by the way, we actually learned this lesson the hard way. When we first started selling Eigen originally to banks, we would say, buy Eigen, buy AI. And people would get excited because it's AI, and we thought all we need to do was just show people we get data out of documents, and that was it. In reality, a lot of those deployments didn't needed to be worked through. And one of the things that our biggest learning is if you don't connect this AI or NLP or data mining to the actual workflow of the upstream and downstream to you, and make sure that the whole thing works from an end-to-end perspective for your underwriters. In this case, it will be completely useless. So I wouldn't think about AI analytics for the sake of AI analytics. I would think about that as a slice of the puzzle for your broader picture.
Dennis.
Yeah, I think it can be used very specifically in a couple of ways. One, to help you screen risks you definitely do not want in your portfolio. And that's probably, in my opinion, the most useful way. But I would say secondly, on the predictive analytics side, I won't cite specific examples because I think I'm still under NDAs on some of them. But there are a couple who I've identified things that are not in traditional rating plans that are counterintuitive and very predictive of outcomes. And if you can investigate that, understand it, and make sure all of your underwriters understand that specific item so that it's just not a black box type underwriting scenario. I think that can be highly impactful, and the couple of specific programs that I know that do that specifically are just killing their competition.
Sure. Again, another question to both of you. We're just looking at AI because you've actually addressed some earlier points that I wanted to put to you. You know too much. That's what it boils down to. But I mean, look, to what degree do you think that AI and machine learning algorithms can optimize the risk management side of things and also reduce the potential for human error? To a certain extent, bias as well, because you can't get away from that, the idea of this bias infection shaping the material that you have.
I actually think I think it's about algorithm design, and so when we think about what composes of an AI system, it's three things. It's the data that you put in, it's the algorithms that you choose, and it's the features that get optimized. So in our case, for natural language processing, a feature is lowercase letter, uppercase letter. What is a part of speech is this? What is the semantic context of the paragraph or the sentence? All those features that you could choose to build a model. And I think when we think about how do you make sure to remove bias, right, from a system, obviously you need to have some monitoring piece of software that could sort of monitor these three items. Because on the data side, one of the things that we do is we're one of the pioneers of small data AI. I won't sort of go into it. But we can actually, in our system, we actually allow an audit trail of exactly who taught the machine at what time and where. So you can really exactly monitor that specific piece of training data. And this is why sometimes small data AI is better than big data AI, because you really have that auditability. The second point around algorithms, right? And I think this goes to, if you just decide you're lazy, you throw everything into a convolution neural net, you're probably not going to get a lot of AI explainability out. But if you're really thoughtful in using the right tool, right specific algorithms for the right models and keep it slim, you have a much better chance of being able to track what you're doing and, again, eliminate some of those biases that you don't want. And I would say the third point around feature selection is sort of the same thing, right? So back to your driving sort of example, one of the features that might be highly predictive could be gender, right? And you can say, actually, I'm just gonna take that specific feature out of the equation and then run the prediction, right? But you can only do that if you're using specific types of algorithms and not others. So I would say, and I would say those are specific tools at your disposal in order to make I would say a more fair AI.
Dennis.
Yeah, and you brought up the word fair, and that's one of those things that is so amorphous, right? What maybe you think is fair, somebody in the audience may not, and I may not, or whatever. It depends on whose ox is being gored at the moment or perceived to be gored. I would say that the algorithm is the key, and it has to be as blind as possible to any of these things which we find socially unacceptable. And we also need to be mindful that that changes over time, because once again, I'm old enough to remember when using, gender to rate auto insurance in this country was fine everywhere. Now there's a bunch of states where you cannot use that variable. But I think the blindness is the key, and it's very, very hard because we as humans all have our biases. It doesn't have to be against an ethnicity or religion or that sort of thing. I remember a conversation not too long ago with a reinsurer, and he just said, "Oh, I just don't like commercial auto." I'm like, "So you don't think anybody can make money at commercial auto?" And it's a large company, insurer, reinsurer, and he goes, "Oh, well, we spend $1 billion a year researching this stuff, and we can't make money at it." And I said, "So since company XYZ cannot make money at it, you're 100% sure there's no one out there who could make money?" And he just couldn't get past the fact of how their size, how much money they spent on it. And so that was a bias on his part, right? That's not one of these other hotbed issues. But to me, it's all about the blindness of the algorithm and realizing that it's probably going to change over time.
It's a really interesting line that you guys take on this, because I've certainly never heard that expression, fair AI, wrapped into this whole business about the moral blindness, how it actually infects the data processing, how the data is built, and decisions which are based on that. But Dennis, stay with me on this, because look, let's focus on personalization, and it is the personalization of pricing. How is that going to go with data-driven underwriting?
I think that's a fantastic question, and it's always this issue of credibility if you're an actuary. You can take me out of the actuarial department, but you can't take the actuary out of me, I guess. So it's always a mode of credibility, and any individual observation in and of itself is simply not that credible. But I think we're honing in on ways to get closer and closer to more personalized pricing. And I think to do that, you get a whole bunch of benefits. Each individual pays their fair share, which I'm not meaning to be politically charged by saying that. I just mean that it's proportionate to their actual risks that they pose as an insured. And you also get a much more efficient use of capital. So as Gunter was talking about, your investors make their targeted return on ROE, and then if you're really smart, you can figure out how to write a lot more business with a lot less capital.
Okay, do you want to add to that, Lewis?
No, I think
No, you don't. You haven't exhausted your store of knowledge already. I mean, look, I wanted to close this out really by going back to this business about unbiased and not delivering unfair outcomes, and really from the underwriter's perspective, but looking at the pricing models. And it seems like one of these imponderables at the moment, really, doesn't it?
I mean, one thing is it's almost just conceptually to me, personalized pricing and not being biased, it almost seems sometimes contradictory. Because on one hand, you're trying to remove variables that may deem as discriminatory. On the other hand, you're trying to add as much variables as possible to make it the pricing as personalized as possible. So I guess it's really a question of what are the variables you add. So for example, I guess going back to auto, maybe the device, the camera on your car is unbiased in terms of gender, ethnicity, et cetera, but it's a lot of data, right? So it's really about thinking through what variables you take out, but at the same time, what variables you could supercharge.
Okay. Look, gentlemen, I have been putting out appeals to the audience to ask questions, but I think that you've probably satisfied every question that they would probably want to ask. You've been that thorough, that intensive. Is there anybody who wants to put a question to the panel? Don't put any questions to me. But would anyone like to ask the guys something? Because if not, then I'm going to close this down. But I think that you've both been so thorough, and that's never really happened to me before, that you've been so preemptive. You preempted me, and you preempted the audience. So clearly there's an AI thing going on here in terms of how it's being used.
They're just tired.
Yeah.
No, they just preempted
Too much
everything.
barbecue. So my wife's from Kansas City, and I'm going to have to tell her that Kansas City barbecue is better than Nashville.
Ooh,
barbecue.
dangerous territory.
And anyone not from Nashville, and for the record, I am not, make sure you get the real story behind how Nashville hot chicken started. That's an interesting story.
Do you want to tell us the story in 30 seconds?
Sure, I will tell you the story in 30 seconds since I was prompted to by our esteemed moderator. So there was a very famous chicken place in town, and apparently the husband of this couple was quite the philanderer. And to get back at her husband for his philandering ways, she really spiced up the fried chicken that he loved so much. And as it turns out, he loved it even more. They started selling it, and then it became this huge success.
This is a really interesting conversation drift. So we've gone from talking about AI, NLP, to actually Nashville fried chicken, and why it's better than what you get in Kansas. I mean, I can't make the comparison because I've yet to go to Kansas, and I'm also a vegetarian, so I'll never get the comparison.
Well, I'm sorry.
Barbecue cauliflower.
Yeah, the cauliflower's good. I've had the cauliflower. But you know what? We're not here to talk about food. Why not? Why not? But guys, it has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, especially from my point of view, because I'm not very good with technology. I'm not very good with maths either. And I just wish that I had you guys teaching me in my formative years, because who knows what I would have done with AI and
We can definitely go into differential topology, which we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
You know all about the wave equation. You'd be able to solve the hydrogen atom, all these things that we talked about.
No, you really don't know what goes on inside my brains, but guys, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much. It has been a fascinating discussion, absolute pleasure meeting both of you. Thank you. I think they deserve a huge round of applause. And do you know what? The chicken story, I'm going to dine out on that when I get back to London as well. Thank you so much. Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on now because we've been talking food, we've been talking AI and whether it can be biased or unbiased or whatever. What we're going to do now is focus on an area which is equally important and diving into all things cyber, in fact. So let's dive straight in because we have another superb expert who's going to join me here on the stage, sharing their insights on this topic. Can you please give a big welcome to Michael Drummond. Michael, please come and join us. Yep, sure, help yourself.
Excellent.
Okay, so we're talking cyber, not chicken, okay?
Sure. I was just going to start off, I think Nashville has amazing barbecue.
Yeah,
So.
I mean, you might want to merge the two subjects together. There could be a connection there, you never know.
Well, I'll try.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Well, that's your challenge for the afternoon. But look, let's start up with you telling the audience what it is that you do and for whom.
Yep. I'm head of cyber and tech E&O for AppBay. We're an InsurTech MGA. Utilizing technology in our underwriting process, which delivers a lot better underwriting results historically versus traditional cyber insurance.
Okay, fantastic. And you didn't use the app the last time because the guys said so much. You decided there's no point asking them any questions. But look, please do use the app. If there are any questions you want to put to Michael, go for it. Okay, it's not every day we have somebody as brilliant as this on the stage. So look, let's kick off by you setting the scene. What do you see as the top cyber risks for 2022 and possibly beyond? What is it we need to be looking out for?
Yeah, I mean, it's frankly a lot of the same. There's three areas where you see most cyber attacks originate from. Number one, unsecured remote access to your networks. Number two, some type of software vulnerability. Or number three, email, right? So traditional email vector like phishing, and stuff like that. So once you look at those three types of common ways that that attackers execute whatever they're trying to do, from an actual risk standpoint, what we're seeing the most often is ransomware, which everyone raise your hand if you're familiar with cyber, you know what ransomware is. I see a few out there. Okay, great. So I won't get into the full details of what that is, but I mean ransomware and financial fraud for pretty much I would say any cyber book out there is the biggest threat. You can manage financial fraud through sublimits and the frequency, but from a both frequency and severity standpoint, ransomware is the biggest threat to, pretty much every cyber book that's out there these days.
Yeah, I mean, how have the ransomware attacks evolved? I mean, would you find, for example, that, again, a lot of cyber experts have said this, that because of what happened with COVID, the world goes into lockdown, and it was a great time for the cyber criminals. Did it help in the evolution of the ransomware attacks, actually taking them to a level which perhaps we've never seen before.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about how ransomware is operating these days, ransomware as a service, most of you have probably heard that before, right? I mean, a lot of these ransomware groups operate their businesses at an enterprise level, right? Like they have offices overseas where it's people's in, cubicles reaching out, talking to companies, trying, to get them to pay these ransoms. I think one of the more interesting things that you've seen, at least over the last year, and we've seen it in our own portfolio, where historically attackers, they would just lock up your systems, right? They would demand some payment, typically in Bitcoin, and once you pay that ransom, they give you a decryption key, and you can unlock and get back to work. What you're seeing more and more now is that what they're doing first is they're actually downloading all of your customer data, and then they use that data as leverage to get you to pay the demand. So where historically you would be able to, if you had viable backups, you can just restore all your systems from backups and, frankly, give the bad guys the middle finger and say, hey, we're good to go, right? These days, you see a lot more companies where they're having to, pay a demand because they don't, they want to protect the customer information from going public.
And of course, up until recently, in fact, we know that cyber insurance, it had been pretty slow to gain traction. So how have you seen attitudes change in the past year? Because, we've seen how these ransomware attacks have become more sophisticated, and in the process, perhaps exposing new vulnerabilities, again, which none of us had ever considered.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, historically, if you were a company where you didn't think you held a lot of, consumer information or healthcare information, you didn't think you had cyber exposure, because back, 5 to 8 years ago, it was largely centered around data breach, retail breaches, stuff like that. All of these industries that have historically been viewed as very low risk from a cyber exposure due to not having data, manufacturing, construction, et cetera, have become these huge targets for ransomware groups. And they're also the industries that have been most susceptible because they've had poorer controls.
But I mean, we can talk about cyber risk, but it's very difficult to price. I guess it's going to vary according to the size of your business, what it does, all that sort of stuff. So given that, how can AI actually lend a hand to make the pricing more accurate?
Great question. I'm not an actuary like the two gentlemen sitting up here beforehand. I'm a lawyer by trade, so I'm not going to sit here and beat around the bush that I'm an expert on AI in this topic. I think it comes down to the quality of data that you have. Frankly, from a pricing standpoint, we still rely very much on HI, human intelligence these days. I like that approach. But we are utilizing a lot more machine learning when it comes to risk selection, looking for operational efficiencies and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Now, in the future, can you have an AI model that can analyze all of your different data points at one time and adjust pricings real time and stuff like that? Sure, I'd love for us to get there, but obviously we have a lot of work to do before then.
Well, you know what? That's a great answer for a lawyer.
Yeah.
Can't fault it.
Thanks.
But I mean, will the off-the-shelf products themselves actually make the line mainstream or take the line mainstream, or is parametric the solution for cyber risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on the parametric side right now. I think there's always going to be a demand for more comprehensive solutions. If you look at most parametric coverage, at least particularly in cyber right now, it focuses just on specific areas of the risk. For example, we have some good friends at a company called Parametrics who are doing downtime insurance, for AWS and Azure, and that's what they focus on. And in concept, it's basically they underwrite at the beginning. Here's like a guaranteed payment of downtime if this event occurs. There's not a significant forensic accounting investigation and stuff like that goes into it. It's basically if that event happens, they pay it out at this dollar amount. I think it's really interesting from how I tend to think about it too. I think from a risk standpoint, higher exposure to cat loss because you're kind of putting all of your eggs in one or two baskets, Azure, AWS, stuff like that. But I think there's always going to be a lot of companies out there looking for more comprehensive solutions too, because one of the big things about ransomware these days as well is that it can pretty much trigger every insuring agreement in a cyber policy, whether that's third-party liability or business interruption or you're paying an extortion demand. But I am excited to see where parametric goes, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Maybe this is a slightly unfair question, but let's see how we get along with this. Because look, can you tell me, what is the potential market for a personal lines cyber product?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few examples of it out there right now. You know, there's, you see some cyber lines in like homeowners policies, stuff like that. I was talking to some colleagues from Cover Genius who are writing personal lines for cyberbullying and the like. I think, you know, personally, in my own opinion, with kind of the emergence of the gig economy, right? More folks working from home, working as independent contractors, where there's really that kind of blend between personal and business when they mix together. I think that's an interesting space to look into.
And look, with cyber insurance, we see that there's often demand for more than just pure financial coverage. And I'm looking at this in terms, for example, of pre- and post-incident services like legal advice, forensic services, consultancy, that kind of stuff. So the bottom line is, how can insurers actually extend their offerings against that backdrop?
Yeah, you know, for us personally, like I said, we utilize technology in our underwriting process. So we've developed a proprietary scan where every insured that we underwrite to, we can, just using their website address, we can identify all of their externally facing technology assets and check that against a lot of the common vulnerabilities that attackers use to launch ransomware or financial fraud attacks. So if we can see it, the bad guys can too. And what we'll actually say is, hey, if you have an open RDP port, for example, which, you know, if you look at a lot of the incident response vendors, you know, 50% of all ransomware attacks start with an open RDP. We can actually drill down specifically down to what IP address that open RDP is on, and we'll require the insured to close that port before we bind their policy. But it doesn't stop there. You know, if we just only underwrote or used our technology at the initial point of underwriting, we would miss 80% of the open RDPs in our portfolio. So what we do is we also have this concept of active risk management or active risk monitoring, where we continuously scan our portfolio throughout the lifetime of the policy, you know, a few times a month. As new threats emerge, we have an entire cyber research team dedicated to you know, identifying new vulnerabilities and updating the model. We'll actually send security alerts out to all of our insureds, and then we have a separate security services team that will work with them to close those. And what we've actually seen is, you know, based on utilizing, you know, this technology at both the intake and through ARM, we see 5 times lower frequency for ransomware than the rest of the market.
But do you see tougher data protection regulation acting as a catalyst in the commercial cyber market?
To be honest, no. I mean, anyone that saw GDPR, I think it was not that big of a deal, to be honest with you. You know, it's frankly, the government's really absent in this space, right around, particularly around the security piece right now. If anything, they're penalizing the companies. You know, if you're a company and you buy some software from somebody, and you know, today it's great and it's working, you know, awesome. Tomorrow they have some new zero-day vulnerability that puts your entire company at risk. You know, it's just, I feel like it's a tough place to put companies at. What I would love, frankly, would is see more focus and regulation on, you know, technology companies and, you know, working with them to establish a new baseline of like configuration. For example, if, you know, all the email service vendors out there today said, hey, you know what, we're just gonna mandate that every, you know, every deployment must have multi-factor authentication enabled in order to access email. I think that would make a huge difference to the market, you know. Threatening people with fines and penalties for things that are, frankly, a lot of times out of their controls, I just don't think is a good place to be.
This sounds very, very familiar. But I mean, look, what does cyber resilience look like in the next normal, whatever that definition will be? And more to the point, how have strategies had to pivot because things are changing all the time? Yes,
I mean, again, you know, from an underwriting standpoint, one day your book could be very secure. Next thing you know, new zero-day, 50% of your portfolio is exposed. I think, you know, folks need to continue investing in the areas that, you know, cause the loss most often. Sure. So not to kind of beat the dead horse here on kind of what what I think it is, but securing your remote access, VPN, RDP, having a regular patching cadence for software vulnerabilities. I mean, we still see companies that we scan that have vulnerabilities that have had patches available for the last 5 years, and then obviously email, investing in good email security, because at the end of the day, that's still a very easy point to get into a lot of organizations, and investing in good inbound mail protection like Gmail or something like that, right?
Something as basic as the email.
Yeah, that can go a long way from just preventing those malicious emails from getting to the end users in the first place.
So given that, what is next for cyber insurance?
Yeah, I mean, for us, continuously focus on expanding our asset detection capability, right? So, a good analogy I like to give for our scan is if you were insuring a house from burglary, right? You'd want to drive by and make sure that the windows are closed, there's locks on the doors, stuff like that. That's basically what we do from a technology standpoint when it comes to cyber underwriting, and improving and investing in our ability to detect more technology assets, widen the breadth of what we can pull into the scan, as well as continuing to invest in our cyber research team, right? Because we have a team of ex-Israeli Defense Force that have worked in Cyber Command for the Israeli military, specialize in this stuff. They're the ones on the dark web, identifying what the new vulnerabilities coming out. Frankly, I think our success is really dependent on how quickly we can adapt and identify these new things. Because again, cyber is not a set it and forget it product. I mean, we're only as good as the data that we have, and our ability to be able to react quickly and update our strategy, in real time.
Okay, Michael, we're going to have to leave it there, but that was an absolutely fascinating discussion. It even topped the chicken.
Yeah.
Michael, thank you so much. Please show your appreciation.